Hi, my name is Charles H. Green. People tell me the best way to remember is like Charlie Brown, but green. I've written 3 books and give a lot of talks and lectures based on that: The Trusted Advisor, Trust-Based Selling, and the Trusted Advisor Field Book. You will astutely pick up a common theme there. It's trust and trusted business relationships. That's what I write about, that's what I talk about, and that's what I'd like to chat with you briefly about today. First of all, there are a few benefits to thinking about trust-based relationships. Let me just mention a few of them. One of them is that if people trust you, they tend to take your advice. And don't minimize that. If you have a teenager at home, you know what it's like to try and give advice and see whether it's taken or not. Another one is that people tend to work with us in a longer time frame. We get a longer time to develop relationships and put things in context instead of having to put all the marbles on one transaction. There's a well-demonstrated connection between trust and innovation. When people trust each other, they share, they take risks, they open up, and the result of that is that people generate innovations. When there's trust in a relationship, work gets done faster. Just plain gets done more quickly for a whole variety of sub-reasons. And then finally, I'd mention, when you have a trusted relationship, people give you the benefit of the doubt. You're allowed to make a mistake every once in a while. It's human. In fact, that's one of the points I want to talk about today, the fact that trust is very much human. If we think about untangling trust and pulling it into different parts, there are several definitional issues that come up. For one, is trust personal or is it institutional? Do we trust people or can we trust businesses? Second one, a very important distinction, is between trusting and being trusted or trustworthy. And then finally, good question, can you make people trustworthy or do they come that way? Is it a make or buy kind of a situation? So I want to talk to each of those. You may think by starting out that a good way to think about trust is looking in the dictionary, and while that makes sense in principle, unfortunately, not so much in practice. For example, I trust my dog with my life, but not with my ham sandwich. Not a very good joke, but it's a joke that rests upon the differences between meanings that are kind of implicit. Trust is one of those things that depends greatly on the context. Here's a much more real-world example. Trust in financial institutions is down. Well, think about that. What does that really mean? Does it mean, A, that banks and financial institutions have become less trustworthy? Or does it mean, B, that we tend less these days to trust banks and financial institutions? Is it trustworthy or trusting? In fact, it's probably a mixture of both, but the difference is important because the answers to those two problems are very different. Truth is, trust is mostly personal. Only people do trusting. 100% of the trusting that's done is done by human beings. It makes no sense to say that a company trusts. And most of the people on the other end, the trusted end, the trustworthy end, are also people. It makes a little bit of sense to say that a bank is trustworthy, but it makes generally more sense to say that Joe and Bill and Susie are trustworthy. So when we think about kind of the dance of trust, there's this interaction between trusting and being trusted. And I want to talk about each of those in turn. They're both necessary. But let's start with being trusted or being trustworthy. There's a thing called the trust equation, which allows us to itemize the major components of being trustworthy. And very simply, it's credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-orientation. Credibility is the words that we say. Reliability are the actions that we do. Intimacy is whether or not people feel comfortable with us, interacting with us. And self-orientation in the denominator is, where's your focus? Where's your attention? Who are you focused on, and in whose benefit and service are you operating? Those 4 factors cover an awful lot of what we find out with trust. Now, we've done a survey. 60,000 people, actually, over the years have taken a little quiz based on that equation. And the answers to those number of questions lets us answer some interesting questions. For example, men versus women. Who's more trustworthy? With 60,000 data points, you can generate a pretty good answer when you have a binary question like that. Well, it turns out the answer is very clear, and the answer is women. Women are more trustworthy, statistically provably, than men. And almost all of that difference, by the way, is due to the factor of intimacy in that equation. Women tend to score more highly on the intimate level than men do. Now, that makes some basic common sense when you think about it. Ask yourself, what are some of the more trustworthy professions? Because there are surveys that have been done on that as well. For example, at the bottom of the list of trustworthy professions, we typically find lawyers and politicians. That probably makes common sense to you. It may not be quite so obvious what the most trustworthy professions are. Many of us tend to think doctors, pharmacists, or teachers. The number one most trustworthy profession, though, in almost all surveys is nursing. Now think about nursing. Which of the 4 trust equation characteristics do nurses most prominently evidence? I'd suggest to you it is intimacy. People feel safe, comfortable, willing to entrust secrets, issues with nurses. We are literally and figuratively naked in front of nurses, and they make it okay. So we see a lot of things fitting together here. The most powerful factor demonstrated in that equation in our research turns out to be intimacy. It's not how smart you are, it's not how much you know, it's not even your track record or your integrity. And to my surprise, to some extent, it's not even who you're paying attention to. It is mainly whether people feel safe and comfortable confiding in you. Can they have a dialogue with you? Now, it turns out that whole theme has a lot in common with issues of influence and persuasion. And all of that's connected kind of by risk. So let me talk very quickly about risk. First of all, Ronald Reagan famously said, trust but verify. Well, he was a great orator, but he was not a very good trust scholar. Because the truth is, if you have to verify, it's not trust. If you're trusting, you don't need verification. In fact, there is no trust without risk. That's what that really says. It just makes no sense. If you get away all the risk, you focus things down to just probabilities, and that's not really trust. Some other common sense ways to reflect that. Maybe you've heard the saying that the fastest way to make a man trustworthy is to trust him, to take the risk yourself. Back in terms of the trust equation, we can think of risk as mainly being about intimacy. If you take a personal risk to mention how you're feeling, how the other person's feeling, that's really the driver of trust to a great extent, is intimacy. So with all that as background, let's talk about what do you do with this stuff? How do you create trust? How do you do it yourself, and how do you create organizations and lead in a way that increases the odds of a trust-based organization and environment? Well, I'd suggest there are 3 things to think about. One of them is focus on principles instead of processes. So much of business is about processes. We need to focus on principles. Second, a very common approach in business is to think about skill sets and behaviors. We need to put more emphasis on mindsets when it comes to trust. And finally, a lot of approaches to change management have to do with incentives. I'm going to suggest to you that when it comes to trust, role modeling is much more important. Very quick run through each of those. First of all, the notion of principles over processes. There are 4 principles to think of, and they're going to sound like motherhood and apple pie until you apply them to every single action in your day-to-day life. Number 1, customer focus for the sake of the customer, not for your sake. It's very easy to look at customer focus as a tool to increase market share and so forth. We need to start, however, with the customer, not with ourselves. We'll get to you, but we need to begin by thinking of the customer. Second one, think about interactions with our clients in terms of relationships, not as transactions. When you think of sales, don't think of opening and closing. Think of this as being one interaction in a long, long series of interactions that you hope will go on for a very long time. Very much in the way that you would think of a relationship with a human being that you're interested in. You're meeting a friend of a friend. It's not a one-off. It's something that you behave in the way that you expect to last a long time. Third principle, collaboration. You're on the same side of the table. Don't think of yourself as negotiating or in any kind of zero-sum game with the other person. Think of you as being completely oriented in the same goals, looking for the same kind of thing. And the fourth one, finally, think of transparency as a default mode of operation. Instead of thinking, what can I share here, as opposed to keeping quiet, start by saying, why not share everything, unless it is A, illegal, or B, hurtful to the other person. You'll find if you share more things transparently, a lot of things get easier. Second principle here is mindsets instead of just skill sets. The biggest mindset in many ways is stop thinking about your goals and remember the reciprocity principle. If you help other people get their goals, it's amazing how often your own goals get met as a byproduct. Second principle, the truth is your friend. You cannot possibly control all the aspects of reality that are out there. Make friends with the truth. Get used to saying absolutely the truth, no more, no less. It'll be your friend if you treat it that way. It'll be your worst enemy if you try and outrun it. Third one, take the first risk. There is no trust without risk. If you're lucky, the other person takes the risk all the time, but if you want to create your own luck, you need to take a risk. And finally, There's only a win-win and a lose-lose option in life, in business, in trust relationships. There's no such thing as me winning and them losing. There's no such thing as them winning and me losing. Those don't exist. So there's only win-win, in which case, great for both of us, or lose-lose, in which case, let's figure it out and don't go there. Third approach to thinking about trust-creating relationships is the powerful role of role modeling. A lot of what we think about in business when we talk about making change in trust-based organizations has a lot to do with incentives and environment and so forth. When it comes to trust, nothing beats role modeling. Trust drives business success. Personal interactions, as I've argued before at length here, are what really drive trust. Your mindsets and your beliefs and your attitudes will determine your behaviors. When it comes to personal trust, life is way too complicated to map everything out and remember different behaviors. You need to operate from instinct, from principle, without complicating it. So you need to get your beliefs right so that people see it in you. The phrase, be the change you want in the world, which came from Gandhi, is exactly right here. People watch what you do, not what you say. So act out the role. Don't tell other people what to do. Live it yourself. So just to sum up, trust is overwhelmingly personal. It starts with you. You don't need to wait for your CEO or your boss or whatever. You can begin behaving in this way directly, and others can benefit as soon as you do. I'd sum it up by saying trust, get used to trusting, trust others, and be trustworthy yourself. Trust and be trustworthy. You will appreciate the benefits. Thanks for your time.